So hello and good evening, everyone. I'm very excited to talk with you about the Old Growth Forest Network, Old Growth Forests, and just be a part of this inaugural summer webinar in honor of Leslie Edwards. My name is Sarah Adloo, and as Nikki stated, I'm the Executive Director with the Old Growth Forest Network, a national nonprofit. And my involvement with plants and native plants is homegrown here in Georgia with my studies being at Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia's School of Forestry. I'm also a member of GNPS and I love a good plant rescue. So here I am with 2 big leaf magnolias and bags of ground plants that were rescued and transplanted into my backyard. So I want to take a moment and transport all of us to this place. This is a sensory delight. I hope you can smell the earthy symphony of the turning gears of decomposition, the plants communicating their lives with respiration, evaporation, signaling warnings, enticing with fragrance, even the subtle differences between the scents of a tree, such as a resinous cedar that evokes memories that are stored in a cedar chest. You can feel the soft mist on your skin, protected by the dome of the canopy above you. You hear the shuffle of deep leaf litter while you walk to a welcoming padded seat of a mossy log and examine the abstract art created by interwoven lichen and liverworts. A seedling is growing from one of the grooves in the down log in front of you, indicating a future generation at your feet. Birdsong flickers as a warbler threads a path between the many layers of forest climbing above your head. Many of these sensory delights can only come from an old growth forest. So I'm very honored to be able to tell you more about these forests, their importance for the living world, and the work of the Old Growth Forest Network to protect these very special places. To explain what old growth is, I first need to talk about the idea of forest succession. Forests are not static places. They are dynamic systems, always changing through time. Every forest you see today has been shaped by decades or centuries of growth, disturbance, and renewal. A forest might begin on unforested land or after an existing forest has been destroyed through significant disturbance from fire, storms, or logging. That forest will then grow and progress through somewhat predictable stages of this process we call forest succession. In early succession, sun-loving species such as grasses, certain shrubs, and then maybe pines might dominate the growth. And that's because they really proliferate in circumstances that might come after a major disturbance, like lots of sunshine or poor soil, or their seeds are more prone to germinate after major disturbances. But as the forest grows on and the pines grow taller and they create the canopy, that canopy closes and shade increases. And then species that are more tolerant of the shady conditions, like many hardwoods, get their heyday. Over time, the forest continues to develop and the structure, density, and species mix continues to shift as environmental conditions such as light availability from a changing canopy or soil moisture below shift with that changing forest. And then when we look toward later in that timeline, late succession or old growth forest, it's not simply the final stage of that process. It doesn't end there. Instead, the forest continues to develop as a mosaic. Some trees reach great age, others die and fall over time. They create light gaps that provide the circumstances for the next generation of seedlings or small saplings to grow into that. All that dead wood over time becomes habitat, even nurse logs for new seedlings to have an even greater chance of succeeding. And in these old growth forests, we do see small disturbances restarting the cycle to varying degrees in patches, the cycle of forest succession, but the larger forest system persists. And eventually, given enough time, a large disturbance may come that can clear the forest. Unfortunately, clear-cut logging was that source of major disturbance that eliminated many of our pre-colonial old-growth forests. And it will take centuries for them to return. And unfortunately, when they do return, they often return in a degraded state originally, and it may take centuries on centuries to reaccumulate all the diversity and the carbon storage that was there before. Notice that I have not included any years on this timeline, and that's because the path of forest succession may vary by region or forest type or other conditions that I mentioned. And because the old growth forest network works across the whole country, we don't use a single cutoff to define when old growth starts, but instead we look to a suite of conditions that are nuanced according to the local conditions. Here in the East, generally, forests often begin to show some old growth qualities, take them on after about a century without major disturbance, but that's really just the beginning. And there's a lot of lifetimes of trees that need to cycle for the old growth forest to come into its prime. And as the United States was colonized, we began to see virgin forests disappear. So a virgin forest is a particular term that's separate from old growth. Old growth, I mentioned, is that stage in a forest's dynamics, but virgin forest is a historical term that means it's never been logged in its existence. And you can see how rapidly virgin forests disappeared and how little we have left today from this map. And this map was drawn in the 1920s from Forest Service employee as a history and a projection looking forward. So 1990 was just an idea of what might happen based on the conditions in the 1920s. And so this is virgin forest, but the map is very similar for old growth forests too. While we do have some forests that are now maturing from the original wave of them being cut, cleared, and converted from that mass period of logging, they will only recover if we let them do so by planning for old growth forests of the future that are not subject to logging conversion or other types of land change. At least the things that are in the control of people. We have natural disturbance that comes in, and those are natural components of the life of forests. And of course, indigenous people have harvested timber for all sorts of reasons, but as far as we can tell, there was no disturbance like there was with the proliferation of industrial logging. It just moved at much, much faster of a rate. And here's a 2006 assessment of forest age across the United States, with red and orange being the youngest and blue being the oldest. And since that legend is pretty small, I've noted where 100 years sits with the red arrow at medium green or light green. It's really apparent here that much of the US is relatively young forest, especially here in the Southeast. Part of that is the recovery from logging, as I mentioned, and a lot of the land clearing for agriculture that happened in this region. But with so many forests being rotated for timber production also in this region, we will continue to see a lot of young forest because they're being cut and regrown on 40-year or so intervals. And if you look out west, that's where a lot of our older stands are because there were some landmark conservation initiatives that set aside some of the last uncut forests before it was all cut. And you can see the stark difference between the industrial timberlands of the Olympic coast, that red-orange area up in the top corner, with the dark blue of Olympic National Park. So why focus conservation efforts on the oldest forests? As I've shown you, we have such a scarcity of these places across our nation's forests. Estimates from previous distribution and occurrence of old growth show that we've lost 99% of what was here prior to colonization in the East and 95% in the West. And it takes 200 years to replace a 200-year-old forest, so being proactive is very important. And we have to be proactive in a way that's going to last into future generations because these processes take longer than human lives. We focus on these age classes because we believe they have outsized ecological value and benefits. And I could spend a whole talk just on that, but I'll shorten it to just the highlights. Carbon storage, high biodiversity, refugia and habitat for old growth obligate species. And many species and families of species have adapted to the conditions of old forests. And with such a loss, we've seen direct loss of the habitat for those species. And we need to protect forests that are old growth and soon to be old growth because it takes so long for those characteristics to return to a forest that we need these places right now to feed, shelter, and reproduce. And additionally, with the amount of biomass and the many layers of those forests, the large trees, the complex soils, they sequester and store a lot of carbon, which is a natural solution toward mitigating climate change. And in addition to these ecosystem services and ecological values, they're places that are of high importance to people. Many find them to be spiritually significant, peaceful escapes, and often have preferences for passive recreation in these places, like hiking, forest bathing, that kind of thing. And if you look at this picture, which is from the Tongass National Forest in Alaska, who would not want to spend an afternoon in this place? Lastly, reverence and respect and the intrinsic value of these forests are all worthy of recognition. And I'll tell you some about the Old Growth Forest Network. So we are the only national nonprofit focused specifically on old growth conservation issues. The mission of the organization is to create a national network of protected, publicly accessible old growth forests, not only for the people today, but for the benefit of future generations. We've been around since 2011 and now have grown to a staff of 10 spread around the country. We are a 501c3 funded almost entirely by individuals and family foundations that believe in this mission. And a bit of our history, the organization was founded by Joan Maloof, a botanist and ecologist who has written a lot about eastern old growth forests. Some of you may have read her works, such as Teaching the Trees, which was published by UGA Press. So I'll share some specific information about our criteria for a forest to join the Old Growth Forest Network. Typically, we are looking for the one forest in a county that best encapsulates the age or character of old growth. Our second criteria is that it allows public access. It's open to the public to some degree, and that ranges from wilderness to other types of access, even some sensitive communities where you have to work with the land manager to get a certain time and a guided tour. And then finally, they have to be protected from commercial logging or are able to become protected through our work with them, bringing them into the network. And in the bottom half of this slide, I've included a list of the many types of protection policies we review or even strengthen for a forest or a portion of a forest as verification of the protections from commercial logging when it joins our network. And this is the challenging and very important part of our work. We are going through some of these policies with a fine-tooth comb. And building up this network of old growth forests and future old growth forests coincides with three broader goals of our organization. First is identification. So we help people understand general and specific old growth characteristics. We encourage them to use those as a lens for looking at the places they visit and hike in. And occasionally we're able to find places that are previously unrecognized or unknown old growth remnants. Next is protection. We go through management plans and other policies with that fine-tooth comb I mentioned to understand if they really have sufficient language for ensuring that that forest will remain standing in perpetuity. When there are gaps, we will work with a landowner or land manager to find solutions that work for their properties to help bring them into the network, or we assist local communities if they want to advocate for stronger protection for their local forests. And unfortunately, there are cases where existing land or logging protection was just assumed. We would never cut that forest. You know, it's just not anything anyone would ever picture. But with the change of leadership or change in priorities or a budget deficit, you might see the forest suddenly become vulnerable. So we learned that those assumed protections may not actually be the case until you look at it specifically to see if they're in writing and documentation across different types of protection policies. And then the most enjoyable part of our organization's work is facilitating the connection between people and forests. When a forest is inducted into the network, we have a celebration and a hike, and we include community members, stewards, other stakeholders. And our network is available online with maps and web pages dedicated to each forest. And people can consult these who are looking to see the many types of old growth forests that we have around the country, different forest types, what they look like, visitation information. And I truly believe that map makes the best road trip you could ask for. So here is the current status of the old growth forest network. And the mission of OGFN is truly a generations long goal because we're building this network of old growth and future old growth county by county. We do our work wherever forests grow, which at our current estimate is 2,380 out of 3,140 counties or county equivalents that can actually support forest types on their landscape, as opposed to grassland, desert, or other types of land cover where forests wouldn't thrive. And this growing network is currently at 306 forests across 39 states. The Old Growth Forest Network was founded in Maryland, so there's currently an overrepresentation in that general area of the country because of the early years of our work, but we're certainly expanding and reaching new places. And I encourage all of you to go explore this map on our website, learn about the forests included, and plan a visit to some of them. And then we provide a plaque to each network forest when it joins. And so if you go to some of these forests, you may see this at certain trailheads, and it's a really wonderful reminder of what you're about to walk into. And it connects people to this broader mission from just a visit to a park or an afternoon walk. And to help the public learn to identify old growth forests, we've also created some introductory guides on old growth features broken down broadly by dry and moist forests, as well as a glossary, which can be found on our website. I'll just quickly point out here that the features are not only about big living trees. There are indicators and clues of the secret ingredient of time since a forest was last disturbed that show up in dead trees, in downed wood, the special forms that old trees take on as they've stood the test of time and dealt with the changes going on over decades or centuries in a forest. And the heterogeneous spatial layout of older forests is a really important component. And that's something that if you're looking closely, you can understand that that's going on around you when you see a light gap next to a big old downed tree that once occupied it. And then one thing you probably won't see in old growth forests, at least at this point in forest recovery across the US, is the signs of recent human alterations, such as a lot of cut stumps, old stone walls and field terraces, or big singular old trees among many young ones that were more likely to be areas where a field grew back into a forest and there was one big shade tree there. Okay, I get to go through some Southeast examples. So there's among those things that are we can and cannot see, there's certainly more than meets the eye with Southeastern old growth forests. First off, a big tree does not equal an old tree. While trees do gain mass and diameter as they age, their growth is also largely a factor of sunlight, soil type, water availability, nutrients, and the species itself. So this is an image of the largest tulip poplar in the state, but tulip poplars are notorious for growing tall and large quickly. In comparison, there's a forest that is only probably an hour's drive away from this tulip poplar that is growing on 3 inches of soil on the top of a mountain. The trees there are only about 12 to 15 inches in diameter and about 2 stories tall, but some of them are up to 500 years old. So in honor of Leslie Edwards, I'm going to take us on a tour of some of the old growth types found across the ecoregions and natural communities of Georgia. Across the next 5 slides, I'll show you some of the information that has been set by the U.S. Forest Service in its assessment of Southeastern old growth criteria. some special features of old growth forests found in the region, and some examples of where you might find old growth forests in these ecoregions. So I want to note, this is kind of what you'll see when I go through these ecoregions. In that table, the forest community types I mentioned are terms used to outline common assemblages of plant species that tend to be grouped in certain areas, usually characterized by the dominant tree species. So you might see specific species mentioned in these forest community types, such as cypress, or they might be broader groups, such as hardwoods. And then among these forest terms, two you might see are mesic and xeric, which are moist and dry. And those are interrelated to the soils, the aspect, the slope, the elevation, and what species can survive there. And I've included an example of a mesic hardwood at top and a xeric pine oak forest on the bottom. And then one note on these metrics that I'm including in the table. We have stand age, we have large tree diameter, and dead trees per acre. And so these different factors were developed with research on forests throughout the Southeast, where mature and old growth forests may have been more accessible to research. But these are also minimum numbers. And so we don't want to understand any upper limits of what a forest can grow. And so I just want you to know that these are all minimums. And with these metrics, these are the US Forest Service ones, but definitely don't take them as gospel. Different groups have developed different indicators and criteria, and these numbers don't necessarily cover all types and conditions of old growth forest communities in Georgia. And I've just pulled out some examples of what we might see across the different ecoregions. And the forest communities are not limited to only those ecoregions, and they can be found across others as well. They're just examples. So other groups that have definitions for different forest community types are the Nature Conservancy or the Society of American Foresters. They might have more fine-grained versions that don't just say hardwoods, but what kind of hardwoods. And just for your reference, these are coming from the US Forest Service Region 8 Old Growth Documentation from 1997, with some updates given during the 2023 Old Growth Definition Development process that happened a few years ago. First, Cumberland Ridge and Valley. So two forest types that you might find here are mixed pine, hardwood, mesic forests. So those are more moist, and then drier oak pine forests. And the large tree diameter measure is, that minimum threshold I mentioned. And dead trees are a really important part of the old growth fabric. And this dead tree per acre measure might indicate a shorter general lifespan of the tree species that are in those communities, or longer lifespans, the frequency of disturbance, or sources of mortality in that forest. So having a high number of dead trees per acre is not necessarily a bad thing. And two special features you might find in old growth forests of this region are cliff perched old growth trees that are often fairly small and growing out of the cracks of rocks very high up. Those are challenging to age, but also challenging to cut. And so that's why a lot of them, and none of them grow straight. So people would not want to cut those for lumber anyway. And then another factor is the rich diversity of ground plants that rely on long time spans for colonization and are fairly sensitive to disturbance. So our trillium species, wild gingers and bloodroot are some examples of species that have pretty limited mechanisms for distribution. So if you see a large patch of them, that means it's been a long time that they've been there, and there's been a lack of disturbance for a pretty long time. And two exemplary older forests in this region are the Marshall Forest in Rome, which is in the Old Growth Forest Network, and the Shirley Miller Wildflower Trail, which is one we're hopeful for as we keep working in the area. Next is the Blue Ridge area, where some special features are steep slopes, rich coves. You might find remnants of chestnut stumps that were cleared across national forest land when chestnut blight was occurring. And you might find some very old hemlocks in this area. And the forest types I'm highlighting are dry oak pine forests, similar to the last slide, and cove forests, which are really beautiful places. Generally, these cove forests are going to have higher tree diameters because of the cove location offers more wind and storm protection and access to water. And you might also see higher mortality comparatively in the drier oak pine forest because of their exposure to these greater sources of stress and disturbance like fire. And then in terms of the very old hemlocks, it is heartbreaking that we're seeing losses of these trees because of the hemlock woolly adelgid, especially because some of them have been documented more than 500 years old, upwards of 600 years. And one of the ones featured here is the headwaters of the Chattahoochee, which is the area that we're calling what we inducted into the network off of the Appalachian Trail, where that spring source of the Chattahoochee is near. You can see my friend Cliff, very tiny, standing there with a huge, wonderful snag that was likely a tree spared from historic nearby logging. And he's told me that he's seen bears at the very top of that tree scramble down. It's amazing. And then I'll highlight the big trees of the Coopers Creek Scenic Area, though it is, this area has a hike called the Valley of the Giants, which is a wonderful experience that I recommend to everyone to go see some big trees tucked away. And then I will mention Sosebee Cove, which is a second growth area. And these are all in the Chattahoochee National Forest. Sosebee Cove is there's a really notable yellow buckeye at the start of the trail. And I've pointed out my water bottle for scale on that one. And these cove forests truly feel like fairyland environments because of the plant diversity there and the just amount of green you get to walk through. Next is the Piedmont, which primarily features mixed pine hardwood forests, hardwood mesic forests, dry oak pine hickory, and oak pine woodlands, among other forest community types that I'm not mentioning. You can see that as pine becomes a more significant part of that mix, the stand ages decrease. And part of that is in some cases, pine will have overall shorter mean lifespans than hardwood species, but there's other factors as well. And special features, once again, those long-lived limited dispersal ground plants you'll find in these forests. And I would say old growth is very rare in this region because this is where we did have a lot of agriculture development and clearing. Two examples of places where you can go see mature forests or old growth forests that are in the old growth forest network are Chicopee Woods in Hall County and Fernbank Forest in DeKalb County. And then the coastal plain. I've highlighted upland pine forests, such as longleaf and slash, coastal plain upland mesic hardwoods, say that 5 times fast, and cypress tupelo swamps, which you'll see in areas that are often inundated with water. Those latter areas, the cypress tupelo swamps, have very long, they have a much higher stand age for minimum age that they're considering old growth because of the very long-lived bald cypress trees. And in this region, fire and hurricanes are much more regular and significant sources of disturbance for forests in this region than in the previous 3 that I mentioned. And the exemplary forests I'm highlighting in this region, I had a lot of choices, but I went with the old growth longleaf forest of the Wade Tract, managed with prescribed fire by the Tall Timbers Conservancy, and the Moody Forest, which is managed by the Nature Conservancy. And here's another excerpt from that Region 8 old growth report that Region 8 is the Southeast, if I didn't mention that already. This lists some of the median ages of the large trees. And I think these are pretty remarkably high for forests that, where there's so little old growth left around it in the region. And these are just the median ages. And so there could be things a lot older. And we too often aren't giving forests the chance for its trees to reach these ages because a lot of them get cut or cleared far before their potential. So there is a growing body of research to understand like how old certain species truly can get. So these numbers could be far larger than we can measure. And there's not a lot to sample from, unfortunately, because we've lost a lot of our old trees. And I also want to quickly highlight what the old growth of this region largely would have been historically. And these are the longleaf pine savannas that prior to their logging and replacement with faster growing pine species for timber were amazing forests with so much biodiversity on the forest floor. They are totally different, wide open places than the mossy, dark, kind of mega tree forests that most people would picture when you say old growth. And finally, the maritime coastal region, where we see a lot of those same coastal plain hardwood forests that I mentioned before, but specifically in this region, they may more commonly include our live oak maritime forests and hammocks, bottomland hardwood forests, and wet pine forests. And I mentioned earlier, bald cypress trees are also a component of these forests, and they can grow for thousands of years. They're amazing. And in the southeastern states, there's some places where you can go see bald cypress trees that are over 1,000 years old. And special features of old growth forests in this region is that they're often in places very hard to access, as there was a lot of logging in this region, especially for timber and shipbuilding and agricultural clearing. So in particular, the live oak trees and the longleaf trees were used, were essential parts of wooden shipbuilding. And so that what we have now is as old growth forest are places that weren't easy to get to for that historic logging. So two exemplary and difficult to access forests in this region is Wassaw Island, a barrier island, and Lewis Island, which is on the Altamaha River that Wassaw Island has a wonderful live oak maritime forest, and Lewis Island has some what are probably extremely old bald cypress trees. And here is a current look at our ongoing work in Georgia. I've highlighted the counties in green where we have volunteers assisting us with on-the-ground assessments of potential forests for the network, as well as ones already inducted. And those inducted network forests are the ones that are numbered. And the dots are just ones that have been nominated that we are working through. So there's a lot for us to expand to because our mission says we want to see a forever protected forest that will either sustain old growth or grow into it in every county that can grow a forest. And Georgia has 159 counties that can grow a forest. And it has the most private timberland of a state in the entire country. So we are searching for these little pockets and remnants across a state that has had an immense agricultural history that has taken a lot of these forests away. So it takes a pretty keen look at these forests through a county to try and find what might still remain. And sometimes these pockets have been, in somebody's family for a very long time, and they've always just had the agreement that they want to leave this place as it is to grow wild. And we want to be there to support them and see how they can make that an even longer term project. So the Georgia Forest and the Old Growth Forest Network, we have Mark Trail Wilderness up in the Chattahoochee National Forest, and that's the one I referred to as the headwaters of the Chattahoochee. You can get there on the Appalachian Trail or the Jack's Knob Trail. Marshall Forest in Rome, Chicopee Woods in Hall County. We've inducted Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park, which is a maturing forest. It was cleared to serve as a battlefield, and areas are still maintained as that battlefield, but the forest that has grown up around it is older than the surrounding forests that of the Cobb County area that were stayed agricultural for longer. And so it's got a little advantage in terms of age than the surrounding areas, and is protected as a member of the National Park Service system. And then in North Fulton, you'll find the John Ripley Big Trees Preserve. And then I will come back to number 6, but Gwinnett County, you can go explore Little Mulberry Park, which is second growth, but maturing in one of the largest at like 900 something acres green space and natural space in the county. And then jumping down to South Georgia, we have the Wolf Creek Trout Lily Preserve. And we certainly have many of these other smaller dots that we are working on. And Sierra Wilbur is our Southeast Regional Manager, and she takes care of these forests. And so I put her email here. So if you have ideas that you want to send to her, you can do it that way. Okay, and so the original Forest of Atlanta is actually a mini network within our larger network. And that's because there were so many small areas that were worthy of recognition. And so when you go on our website, you can see all of the smaller areas in there. And so we want to hear from you. Go onto our website, you can nominate a forest, and you can also sign up to be a county coordinator, which is our on-the-ground volunteers assisting us with the assessments of potential forests for the network, as well as keeping an eye on the ones that are already in it. So if you'd like to be more involved, you can either provide us the nomination or get in touch with Sierra to talk about forests. And so thank you all for joining me this evening to talk about the joy of old growth forests. I hope you've learned something and you feel inspired to seek out these special places and advocate for their protection. Please do visit our website, see the full map, check out our social media, and do join our email list so you can receive updates on when more Georgia forests join the network and you can come to those celebrations. And we can also give you news about old growth forests across the country. And lastly, you can help support our work by donating toward our mission. We're private, we're funded by people who believe in it, or you can volunteer to be those boots on the ground for old growth near you. So thank you so much. I think Nikki is going to look at the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. So I'm going to bounce around here. We'll kind of start with some forest and plant questions. Someone asked, and I'm not sure you'll be able to answer this, but we can always get some research in the afterwards. Is there a book that includes the flora of Georgia with a key? And I think, particularly for, old growth forests, or are there any other helpful books for us to use when we're wandering in an old growth forest?
Well, for the Southeast, I'm not sure because we have such just a range of forest communities. That would be a very intense book. But if you're in other parts of the country, I do want to just give a recommendation for a wonderful book in the Northeast called The Ancient Forest Guide to New England, or Forests of the Northeast, by Bob Leverett, who's one of our volunteers. It is considered the gold standard for finding all those places to visit and what's going on there. But it sounds like there's something that needs to be written for the Southeast.
All right, folks, someone needs to hop on to that. All right, next question from Camera. How large does an old stand of trees need to be deemed, quote, a forest?
I can only refer to one paper that studied the dynamics that go on in different size forest patches and said generally at about 14 acres, you start to see behavior of what we consider a forest in terms of regeneration and recruitment and habitat for different species.
Okay, so, oh, go ahead.
But I would still call anything smaller a forest. I'm just referring to the little bit of research that's been done on the idea.
So building on that question, Julie wanted to know, is there a minimum number of acres that will qualify a forest to be old growth? And does this depend on the region?
No. So typically with the old growth forest network, we are looking for things that are 10 acres or larger because we're often looking among multiple forests within a county and trying to make a decision on what the highest impact for the future is going to be. But that does not exclude or preclude really interesting small forests from joining our network.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth would like would like you to describe a wet pine forest. What type of pines make up a wet pine forest, and perhaps other indicators of this type of forest?
So I'm not a botanist. I can't go into too much detail in this, even though I wish I could. But you'll see some slash pine forests that can keep wet feet. I'll just say that that can have the wetland features going on, and you might see pitcher plants in communities like that, which would be a really cool feature. But you'll see a lot of grasses too, and I would give an example. If anyone finds themselves in the panhandle of Florida, the Ocklawackney State Park, another mouthful, has a longleaf stand that often gets ephemeral ponds in it that you can trudge through on your trails, and so you can study that area if you want to learn more.
Great. Okay, so we have a couple of questions about the network. Actually, someone pointed out it was surprising to not see any forests identified in Alabama. Is that coming in the future?
We're working on it, yes. So there's definitely a lot of really biodiverse forest throughout Alabama. And we have wanted to start with something really notable. And so we've had some long projects going on, but I'll just say stay tuned. They're in the works.
Great. And then David also wanted to know, do you have any connections with the champion tree registry? Are champion trees normally in the old growth forests?
We do have a lot of overlap with where champion trees are, and I guess we are connected to the National Champion Tree Registry, which is now headquartered in Tennessee. But our we have a lot of volunteers that are folks that go out and look for old growth forests, who are also folks that go out and measure and score champion trees, and have shared a lot of that valuable information with us.
Great. Okay, so we have a couple questions. Is your organization or organizations you work with in danger of losing government grants under the new administration?
It's a risk for a lot of people. We only have one government grant currently that focuses on how forests promote water quality, drinking water quality for the Great Lakes. And so far that has sustained, thankfully, but it's certainly an issue. Um, and I just encourage anyone who wants to help support those organizations to help fill in that gap while they may be suffering from restrictions on the grants that they were operating with before.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Dale. Can privately owned property qualify to be included in the old growth forest network if public access is not allowed?
We have a specific program for that, and it is called our Private Forest Registry. And you can find that section on our website and learn more about it. But we give a plaque and a letter of recognition to people who have private forests that there's no expectation of public access, or we don't share the location or anything like that. But we do talk about conservation initiatives and the future of those forests, and try and connect them to information on the best practices for stewarding their forest. But we would love to hear about it.
Great. So I know you answered this earlier, but we had another question. Is there a page on your organization's website for nominated or potential forests that are coming into the network, or is that information not available publicly?
So it's technologically not available because it's 1,000 forests. And so to keep that updated on our website would be very challenging. We have our own internal database and GIS maps and information where we keep tabs on these forests, and they work through the process. And we have a lot more demand than we have manpower. And so we're at a point where we're hoping to grow.
Awesome. Well, I saved the fun question for last, and I'm scrolling through to see. We do have a question that I missed from Mark. Is there a policy about controlled burns in the mountain cove hardwoods? Just concerned about spring ephemeral flower species richness after a burn has been done.
I can't speak to that. We don't do any actual management on any of these forests, and largely stick to making sure that there's logging protections on paper. But there's so many different things that we could be engaged with that we have to keep it narrow.
Great. Well, I just want to point out to everyone in the chat, we have our friend Eli Dickerson, who now works for Park Pride. He's put a couple of great links, information on champion trees, information on old growth. So do check those out, and I will try to grab those and put them in the follow-up. But Sarah, I think I've gotten through all the questions, but I've saved the best one for last, and it is from Eli. What's one of your favorite tree species and why?
Oh, I think my favorite has to be American Beech. And I think they're my favorite because I despise winter. Um, and beech trees are the shining silver lining to winter in a forest. They bring gorgeous ochre color. The leaves are dried and they stay on the trees. And so when the wind comes through, that's the main sound that you hear, is that rattling through the forest, and their silver bark really stands out in the winter. So I'm going to give it to the beech.
Awesome. Well, American Beech was the GNPS Plant of the Year, I believe, back in 2022. So we will try to dig up a Plant of the Year t-shirt for you if we still have any of those hanging around, since you love American Beech. Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. This was a fascinating presentation. And thank you for Sierra. I see that you've joined. She is the representative from Old Growth Forest Network in the Southeast. And I will make sure to add her email to the recording and follow-up email from this presentation. So as I mentioned, this was recorded. We are going to send this out to everyone who registered over the next couple of days, and it will also be posted to our YouTube. And if you have any questions for Sarah, she did provide the information to contact her and her organization. And I want to thank everyone tonight for a lovely evening. And I hope you were inspired to maybe take a couple field trips with fall coming up into some of our gorgeous old growth tracks right here in Georgia. Thank you so much, and y'all enjoy your evening. Good night.